Welcome back, everyone. Today in class, we really didn't get a chance to finish everything that I wanted to finish. We kind of got stuck talking solely about the different labor unions, different labor movements as far as the AFL and the Knights of Labor and kind of what they stood for and kind of their characteristics as far as what they were demanding and the tools of management and labor. And so we really didn't get a chance to talk about any of the big strikes and the violence and all these things that are taking place in the late 1800s in these northeastern manufacturing cities. And so that's really what we're going to focus on today in the screencast. So actually, a lot of the slides that I got for this screencast, I got from that website, historyteacher.net, that I asked you guys, to take a look at and to help you study with the quizzes. And so you could always do that too. Take a look at her PowerPoints and see some of the things that she's putting up there. Her name is Sue Poser, and she has a lot of good PowerPoints. So it might be good for you guys to review or to get a preview of the lesson and take a look at some of these. And sometimes I like to use some of her PowerPoint, some of her slides because it's better than some of the stuff that she has some excellent maps and some things that I want to show you. So what we're going to start with are some of the famous strikes, really three famous strikes that take place in the late 1800s. So the first one is known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And the Great Railroad Strike is also, I think in your textbook they call it the Great Uprising. And really what's happening here, this is in the midst of a depression in America at the time. The economy is starting to decline a little bit. And what starts to happen here is different railroads, they're having trouble because they're cutting their pay and they're laying off workers. And so the workers are going to start to protest and have some boycotts and really some general strikes that are going to break out really in the Midwest. So it starts in Pittsburgh and like the Ohio area. And when this happens, the companies are going to kind of call in federal troops, not federal troops first, but state militia troops actually. They're going to kind of call in the state militia to try and quell the uprising or quell this strike that's taking place. Because the railroad companies are going to make the point that the railroad is for the public good. Kind of like when I told you today that teachers are not allowed to go on strike, it's illegal for teachers to go on strike. They're going to try and make that same argument that the railroad's for the public, and so we can't have a railroad strike because it's going to hurt everybody. It's going to hurt the economy even further. And so when these workers are going on strike, they're going to bring in the state militia, and what starts to happen is violence starts to break out. Labor doesn't back down, and the troops don't back down, and so people are going to start to die. It's going to be an all-out kind of a battle taking place. Now, when other railroad workers hear about what happens, they're going to go on strike too, kind of in a solidarity type movement, a solidarity type move. And so if you look at all the red dots that you see on the screen up there, those are all the places that workers went on strike. And it gets so bad that the president at the time, Rutherford B. Hayes, he has to call in federal troops to stop the railroad unrest and stop what they consider like an uprising here of the working class. And they have to kind of use force to put it down. So if you put it in the context of what's going on in history, 1877 should kind of ring a bell for you in your mind as far as the year is concerned. That's the year that technically Reconstruction ended. And so they're pulling troops out of the South, but then they have to kind of quell this violence up in the North and all these disputes that are taking place. And so when we were learning about Reconstruction, it might have been a little bit hard for you guys to understand that the people in the North are getting weary of dealing with like the KKK and the violence in the South because they're dealing with their own issues up here in the North. And they really need to kind of focus more on their own problems. So this eventually fails and the railroad strike ends, but it's important for several reasons. Number one, people across different geographic areas are going to work together and they're going to go on strike together. Second thing is that it cuts across kind of ethnic lines and in some cases racial lines. It's all of these workers kind of striking together. And so it kind of shows you the power of numbers here. When you have hundreds of thousands of people going on strike, it does have a serious effect. Okay, now, the next big strike that we're going to talk about is the Homestead strike. And so this is going to be in Andrew Carnegie's steel mill here in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Now, what happens to these workers is that they were using collective bargaining. They had a union in Carnegie's steel mills. He allowed for these unions to be there. And what they would do is they practice collective bargaining. So you should recognize that this is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and not really the Knights of Labor. And so at the time, actually we'll come back to this, but at the time, I can't go back. My dog ate it. Remember, I can't move back. He kind of ate that part of it. So you have to kind of think back visually in your mind. What happened here is that Carnegie's kind of right-hand man, he's going to be this guy named Henry Clay Frick. And what he's going to do is he's going to say, well, you know what? You can't collectively bargain your contract. What the union would do is one union representative would go and collectively bargain the contract for everybody. And then every union member would get the same exact contract. And that's kind of how it works in most unions. But what Frick says is, okay, what I want to do is instead of everybody getting the same contract, you have to come negotiate individually, and you have to sign an individual contract if you want to work in the Homestead mills. And so the labor union is going to kind of reject this. And so Frick, kind of anticipating this, what he does is he locks them out of the factory. He wants to hire scabs. And he really, the whole tactic here is to kind of break the union. And so he's going to hire these people, the Pinkertons, like I told you guys about earlier, as like a police force to kind of enforce and make sure that the scabs get to work and that these people these union members do not cause any problems. And what happens again is that violence breaks out. And this again becomes a violent situation here. And it lasts for a while. It kind of becomes a battle of trying to, almost like a mini war here in these places. So for us, I think it's tough to understand that, these battles could take place, that these could be real all-out battles in the street with guns and weapons, similar to two wars, the two countries going at war here. And often, the state militia may come in and try and quell the violence, or the federal government may come in and quell the violence, but sometimes they wouldn't, and they wouldn't get involved. Because remember, this is not a mass media type of situation. There's no television cameras and things on screen every 5 seconds. And so this really got out of hand, and it lasted for about 4 months. They're battling here with the scabs coming to work and trying to lock them out. And eventually, in this case, again, management is going to win. They're going to win out here, and the labor union, again, is going to decide that they can't kind of stand up to them for a longer period of time, and they're going to give in to what Frick really wanted, or what Carnegie kind of wanted in his steel mills, and so they win out again. Now, the next big one is going to be something called the Pullman Strike of 1894. So this is going to be in Chicago. We're going to have a major strike again on the railroads, and this one is important for a couple of different reasons also. What's going to happen here is you have another labor leader is going to kind of get involved here, a guy named Eugene Debs, and he's very much associated with socialism and kind of a different perspective on the economy and kind of who should have the rights and who should have power in society. And so he becomes an important figure because you have different ideologies developing in America at the time, around the world. So you have communism, socialism, anarchism, something else called nihilism that's out there. And these are considered to be radical ideas because people are saying, well, the gap between the rich and the poor is becoming too great. You have super wealthy and super poor, and this is completely unfair. We are the people who are doing all of the work here. So on the Pullman Strike, what they're trying to do is kind of a similar thing. They're trying to lay people off, cut wages, and kind of, it's again in an economic downturn. And so again, they're going to kind of try and strike back here. And what happens here is, again, federal troops need to be called in to kind of quell the violence and to stop the violence here. And these are some, I want to give you guys some articles, some quotes from newspapers about what's going on here. This is from the New York World, which is a newspaper in New York City at the time. And it says, this is a strike, a war against the government and against society. So that's important, that what they're saying here, a war against the government and against society. So notice how they're framing strikers as being anti-America, anti the country, because they're hurting industrial capacity, they're hurting production by going on strike, and it's going to hurt the economy in the long run. And so basically, you have to kind of keep that in mind, that to the general public, through newspapers and through the violence that breaks out, the people are going to associate labor unions with violence, with hurting the economy, with downturns in the economy, and so they're going to get a very negative viewpoint of these labor unions. That's what the Washington Post had to say about what's going on in Chicago. What they said was, This was war of the bloodiest kind in Chicago. The war of the bloodiest kind in Chicago is imminent, and before tomorrow goes by, the railroad lines and yards may be turned into battlefields, strewed with hundreds of dead and wounded. Chicago was never before the scene of such wild and desperate acts as we are witness to today and tonight. So it's very extreme, it's very violent, and you have to kind of keep that in mind. This is not, like I said in class, this is not people standing in front of a place with some signs walking around. These are all-out battles between the labor unions, the people who are hired to break the strikes, and it's pretty extreme. So the president here, Grover Cleveland, he's going to have to get involved in this situation too. So what he says about this, is if it takes the entire Army and Navy to deliver a postal card in Chicago, that car will be delivered. So basically what he's saying here is, listen, we are not going to back down. We are going to make sure that, the strike ends and that the labor and the violence, laborers go back to work and the violence is over. So what you see here is that the government is on the side of the business owners to a large extent during the Gilded Age, during this period. It's going to change later during something called the Progressive period, where it's going to be more balanced, labor and the industrial owners. But at this time, they're clearly on the side of the business owners. And because they look at it as a problem for America, that the labor unions are causing strife in America, and they potentially, in the long run, maybe fear like some kind of uprising from this lower class who are being exploited to a big extent in their industries. And so this is kind of referring to what I was telling you guys before, that these unions are kind of painted as socialists, as immigrants who are anti-American, and they're saying that they're anarchists for what they're doing here. Now, despite all this negative kind of connotation for labor unions, what you're going to see is that the membership in labor unions is just going to keep going up and up and up, because union members realize this is the only way that they can combat the power of the industrialists. The industrialists have a lot on their side. They have wealth, they have influence in the government, and so what they have going for them is that they have to kind of stick together and work together. And if you notice here, so this is again another graph, shows you like really what's going on here with the AFL, and it's really kind of exploded. So by like if you look here by the 1970s, you have huge numbers of people in these unions, and they grow really through the early 1900s all the way up, to the late 1970s. And that was what we were talking about too in class, that by the 1970s we start to deindustrialize, and we change from a manufacturing-based economy into more of a service-based economy. And that's why you kind of see it peak and then start to decline in the 80s and closer to our modern time period. So overall, what union is able to kind of accomplish for these people who are members of the union is they're going to get a lot better treatment, because they're able to work together and they're not going to be kind of picked apart and turned against each other. And so this is modern day, but people who are members of unions, they're going to get better health care, they're going to get better pensions, higher disability, as far as just like workers' compensation and just rights in the workplace. And so a couple of you guys brought up the examples of Walmart and Target in school today who do not have labor unions. And so if you work in an environment like that, it's not as bad as in the late 1800s, because there are laws kind of prohibiting certain treatments, but you're not going to be kind of getting the benefits that people who are part of a labor union are going to get. And if you look at foreign countries, a lot of foreign countries, let's say China, for example, they don't have labor unions like we have here, and that's why workers are so exploited and so taken advantage of, because the workers alone, you as one worker, don't have much power, but together as a unified force, you can gain a lot of power. All right, guys. I will see you guys tomorrow in class. Have a good night.